Watch the cord.
How have you waiting here?
Good evening. My name is Greg Yowitz, and I'm the board chair of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. On behalf of the Jewish Federation, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are thrilled to be collaborating with our community partner, AJC St. Louis, to bring you this exciting and very timely event, which I understand has nearly 350 people registered. I've had the pleasure of hearing our featured speaker tonight on many occasions and look forward to the program. On behalf of the Jewish Federation, I wish you all a happy and healthy Thanksgiving. I would now like to turn over the program to Paul Kravitz, president of AJC St. Louis, who will introduce our guests for tonight.
Thank you, Greg. I am Paul Kravitz, and I am the president of AJC St. Louis. The U.S. presidential transition was formally announced just yesterday. Cabinet positions are being filled as we speak. There are exciting developments in the Middle East and elsewhere. So it is my honor to welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross and Jason Isaacson for what promises to be a very interesting exchange. Ambassador Dennis Ross is Counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is on the faculty at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. During the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations, Ambassador Ross played a key role in the Middle East peace negotiations as the U.S. point person dealing directly with Israeli-Palestinian leaders. He served 2 years as special assistant to President Obama and a year as special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Ambassador Ross is the author of 5 books on the peace process, the Middle East, and international relations. Most recently, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, written with his colleague, David Markovsky. Other books by Ambassador Ross include Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel Relationship from Truman to Obama, and The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace. Jason Isaacson is AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. He oversees our agency's centrist, nonpartisan, political and diplomatic advocacy in our 24 U.S. regional offices and our 12 overseas outposts, with a 13th set to open in the coming months in the United Arab Emirates. Jason has coordinated AJC ministerial meetings in 4 continents, including numerous visits that were the first by an American Jewish organization. In that capacity, he has led AJC's pioneering Jewish diplomacy in the Arab Gulf region, including Saudi Arabia, over the last 25 years. Jason has provided testimony by invitation of the U.S. Congress on Arab-Israeli peace, anti-Semitism, and racial equity. He has lectured at think tanks and diplomatic academies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to remind you to please submit your questions by pressing the questions button at the bottom of your screen. And now, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to AJC St. Louis and the Jewish Federation of St. Louis for organizing this evening's program. And welcome to members of the AJC National Board of Governors who are joining us tonight as well. It has been a turbulent 3 weeks, but as Paul just reported, The US election is finally behind us. President-elect Biden is already naming members of his cabinet. Foreign leaders are extending him congratulations, and we can now safely make educated assessments about the policies the new US administration will pursue and the global landscape that it will face come January 20th, 2021. And it is a privilege for me to attempt these assessments with Ambassador Dennis Ross, one of our country's most experienced and respected diplomatic practitioners and scholars. Dennis, let's begin our conversation with a brief overview of the Trump administration's foreign policy. Secretary of State Pompeo just wrapped up a 10-day trip that was heavily focused on the Middle East, and it contained unprecedented elements, including a visit to Saudi Arabia that reportedly coincided with a brief visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu, a dramatic development, although one that was denied immediately by the Saudi Foreign Ministry. If you look around the globe, not just in the Middle East, but to other regions as well, where has President Trump succeeded and where has he failed to advance the interests of the United States and our allies?
Hey, look, it's a very important question, Jason, because I think we should try to evaluate policies analytically and not politically. I would say when you raise the issue of allies, President Trump represents a strain of American thinking that is deeply rooted, but is mostly something that we saw in the United States prior to World War II. If you look historically, the US was never isolationist. The imagery that we were isolationists, not active around the globe, was simply not true. We were always active. The difference was, you go back to George Washington's valedictory, where he says, we don't need entangling alliances. The mindset of the United States for a long time, until the 20th century, was that basically we could pursue our interests, but we didn't need to be bound to any alliances. We didn't need to be bound to anybody else. We might be the shining city on a hill. We saw ourselves as being unique and exceptional in terms of the values that we embodied. We saw somehow that the US was graced with great abundance and resources and the like. And there was a sense that we didn't need to sully ourselves by being involved in other conflicts or having alliances. Now, why do I raise all this as it relates to President Trump? Because his concept of American first, even though it's the antecedents in the 1930s, are rather unsavory, given who was responsible for American first at that time. The concept of American first predates the 1930s. And it was basically not America first, it was America as a unilateralist. That seemed to change during World War I with Woodrow Wilson, when he fought the war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. But the Senate rejected our membership in the League of Nations. It was Franklin Roosevelt who wouldn't live to see this, but who saw that the US needed to play a role internationally, and Harry Truman presided over the creation of multilateral institutions, as well as a network of alliances. President Trump came in and didn't favor alliances. He saw them as limiting us, as in a sense, binding us to others, and meaning that we would assume obligations that could be costly. So in terms of our alliances are not today in a position that you could say have been improved under President Trump's time. There are many doubts about us. I think you'll see there's enormous relief in Europe and in countries in Asia who now think that the United States will again be focused on how it works with others, will focus again on how it can be a good global citizen in ways that were, in a sense, alien to President Trump. Where he seemed to have an effect was obviously not so much in Europe, clearly not with Russia. With China, you can say he imposed tariffs, but did they really change China's behavior? If you look at the balance of payments and balance of trade, they don't look very different than they did before. The one place where you could say there seems to be more of a positive effect would be in the Middle East, not with regard to Iran, because even though maximum economic pressure was put on Iran, Iran's behavior didn't change. And in fact, on the nuclear issue, it's much closer to a nuclear breakout capability today than it was when President Trump came in. But by the same token, what we see in terms of normalization with Israel is something that has taken place during this administration. How much of it is due to the administration's efforts? How much of it is due, ironically, to a perception that if you can't count on the United States and you're looking at who can be a bulwark against Iran, who can you count on? And actually Israel looks increasingly good to many of the Arab states. But you can't ignore the reality that normalization with the UAE deal, with Bahrain, with the Sudan, did take place now. They did reflect what was an interest in trying to promote Arab-Israel relations. So I think you have to at least say that from that standpoint, the Middle East in that respect looks better than it did. Now, Iran is still a problem, and as I said, in some ways worse than it was. Turkey is much more of a challenge than it was, although there were signs of this even before Trump came in, but much more of a challenge today. So I think when you look around the globe, you might say part of the Middle East looks promising and better than it did. Almost everywhere else, you'd have to say we're not in a better position than we were. And when it comes to a pandemic that respects no borders, in which no one has immunity, the American response to that was atypical. I was a political appointee for Ronald Reagan, for George H.W. Bush, for Bill Clinton, and for Barack Obama. These were four different leaders, very different ideologically, very different about their role of government, but not different about their view of America's role in the world, and not different about their sense that if there was a major international crisis, the US had to be out there very quickly to lead it, to organize it, to create a common approach in response to it. That did not happen with President Trump. And one of the things that probably will happen with President Biden is a very quick effort to reestablish the United States as a global leader. When it comes to pandemics, the US needs to mobilize the rest of the world to create what is a common response to what is a common problem.
Get back to the Middle East for a moment, though, if I may, Dennis. You mentioned the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan. Obvious breakthroughs, but it's also a breaking of the old paradigm that you cannot have peace with other Arab states until you resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which of course you've devoted so much of your career to wrestling with. Does President Trump deserve any credit for kind of changing that whole dynamic? Or was it happening anyway?
Well, I think it was happening anyway. I think he gets credit for taking advantage of it and building on it, but it was happening anyway. And let me tell you an anecdote. So the beginning of the Obama administration, February 2009, I'm called by Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who is the UAE ambassador, who is really the hero of the breakthrough because the initiative was his and the Trump administration responded to his initiative. But so it's February 2009, he calls me and he knows I'm in the State Department at that point before I go to the White House and my responsibility is Iran. And he said, would you come see me? And unusually he said, not to the embassy, but he has a suite at the Ritz-Carlton. He said, would I come see him there? I said, okay, I wanted to talk about Iran. I go there, I knock on the door, he opens it, and who's standing there with him? Salih Meridor, Israel's ambassador to the United States. Now, here was an unmistakable message to the incoming administration. We see things the same way. Maybe we're not broadcasting this relationship, maybe it's under the table, but we see common sense of threats and we're working together. So the process of what I'll call normalization began really even before the Obama administration came in. And it was driven by the common sense of threat, common strategic threat perceptions, and the belief that Israel has something significant to offer. The paradigm, as you put it, existed for a long time. In fact, not my most recent book, but my book, Doomed to Succeed, basically points out what was this erroneous assumption, really starting from the Truman administration, and it carried through the Obama administration. But to be fair, even the first year of the Trump administration, you had Secretary Tillerson and even Jared Kushner, when asked why they were making this effort on the Trump peace plan, even then, they said because the Palestinian issue relates to basic stability in the region. So old habits and old paradigms die hard. What we're seeing is this one is finally being, I think, for many, maybe not everyone, because again, it's hard for people to give up their assumptions. But for many, I think there's a recognition you have to rethink the region. You have to rethink how Arab states are approaching this issue and Israel. And I'd like, I want to continue discussion, but there are a few points I'd like to make about this to explain why this happened and why it has evolved the way it did.
Let's get into that. But first, let me come back to kind of a post-election analysis here, if I may, Dennis. And rather than going right to the question of what do you expect under President Biden,
Yeah.
let me just say for a moment on kind of a process question relating to President Trump. You've served in, as you pointed out, Republican and Democratic administrations, the State Department and the White House. The Trump administration has seen record high turnover in key positions.
Yeah.
And is now on its fourth national security advisor in 4 years. In the face of such changes, how has it been able to formulate and implement consistent policies, or has it? And have the departures of veteran U.S. diplomats over these 4 years affected the ability of a new administration to project American influence and power?
Let me divide that question into its two parts. With the rapid turnover of personnel, there is no question there's been a number of what I would call disjunctures. There's not been a consistent implementation of policy across the board. Clearly, the approach towards Russia has, on the one hand, almost reflected a kind of schizophrenia. You would have the president constantly lauding Vladimir Putin, even as the intelligence community what the Russians were doing, and the Congress was voting sanctions, which the president was not enthusiastic about, but in which the president was, in many respects, went ahead and he was enthusiastic about because it would have been implemented over his veto in any case. So there was a schizophrenia there. In the Middle East, there was, I would say, consistency as it related to Iran. And what I mean by that is, President Trump, when he came in, said he thought the Iran deal was a terrible deal. He didn't withdraw from it until May of 2018. He did it over the advice of his then Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. They both said that the deal was holding and it was better to have the Iranians in it than to have them depart from it. But we departed it and we applied a policy of maximum economic pressure. Iranians today are in a very difficult economic strait, which has been compounded by they're probably the country that suffered the worst, I think, effects, economic, political fatalities from COVID. So they are, I think, in very difficult straits, although they didn't change their behavior. The theory was that President Trump clearly had was we'll put maximum pressure on them and then they'll come to the table. In the summer of 2019, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei gave a speech in which he said, I'm literally quoting now, he said, he was talking about the Trump administration, he said, their aim is to so weaken us that we'll have to come to the negotiating table in a weakened state. And he said, we won't do it. And on the contrary, we have leverage on them. And what you saw at that time, they began to apply their own version of maximum pressure. So they walked away from the limitations on the JCPOA. Tankers exploded, oil tankers exploded. They attacked the most important oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia, and they did it directly, not through a proxy. They were attacking bases where American forces were in Iraq. Having said all this, there was a consistency on Iran that you didn't see on other issues. You would see a kind of, you'd see what I would say is a kind of inconsistency on how we approach NATO. North Korea, obviously, the president was consistent in terms of reaching out to Kim Jong-un after the first year, but you also saw that parts of the administration were trying to reshape what he was doing in terms of his talks with Kim Jong-un. So you had a kind of idiosyncratic approach by President Trump, and you had the structure of the administration oftentimes following a different pathway. And I just think that reflects what was, I'll put it this way, since I'm a diplomat, the sociology of this administration. The sociology of this administration was unique because the president has an impulsive streak. Another example of that, we put forces, and as part of trying to root out ISIS, we put forces into Syria. He has a phone call with President Erdogan of Turkey, who is pressing him to get out of the way of our presence because it's protecting the Kurds in northern Turkey. And he announced after the phone call, we're pulling out. It produces the resignation of his Secretary of Defense. There is an effort to persuade him after the fact not to pull them all out. And he's persuaded on the basis of saying, our forces will be there to protect the oil fields, which is what he said. So, you know, there was a kind of, there were fits and starts in terms of foreign policy. And there was, if you look at the State Department today, the State Department has huge holes in terms of vacancies. And the new administration will have to, I think, try to fill that and try to restore the Foreign Service, which has taken, I think, a beating during the time of this administration.
I'm hoping that recruitment to the Foreign Service program will rise to meet this challenge. Dennis, let's turn to the Biden team and the Biden administration. Of course, Joe Biden comes to the presidency with more on-the-job policy training, foreign policy training than anyone since George H.W. Bush, 1989, having served 12 of his 36 years in the Senate as either the chair or the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, plus 8 years, of course, as vice president. What's your assessment of the president-elect as a strategic thinker and as a promoter of American global leadership? As everyone knows, everyone's read this by now, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates famously pilloried Biden as having been wrong on multiple foreign policy calls over the years. Is that a fair reading?
No, I don't think it's a fair reading. You know, look, I think what you see, I'll divide this into different parts. Part one is that Joe Biden, the president-elect, is someone who believes that the U.S. needs to play a leading role in the world. And when we don't, there's chaos and vacuums that are filled by the worst forces. Now, he's coming in a circumstance where we haven't played that role. And he's going to want to reestablish our relationships with our allies. He's going to want to reestablish us as a good global citizen. That's why he'll very quickly move to, as he said, to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. That's why he will, in the midst of a pandemic, pulling out of the World Health Organization, even if you have questions about it, rather than trying to change it, the administration simply withdrew. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. And so what's the one international institution you have that can deal with it? The World Health Organization. He'll quickly go back into that. But the point is here, you're asking about his strategic sort of worldview. His view of the United States is that when the US is playing a leading position internationally, we are much more likely to have a world that is stable and not, in a sense, governed by a kind of ad hocism, governed by a kind of Hobbesian state of nature where it's every country for itself. And when that happens, you see how Russia is able to extend its influence. You see how China is able to extend its influence. He looks at things through that lens. So he wants the US to be active, but he's also not indifferent to the costs of leadership. And here I would say he probably recognizes that in an ironic way, the combination of COVID, where the US didn't lead and when everyone in the world sees the consequence, and of Trump reflecting what is, again, as I said, a strain in American thinking, and also reflecting frustration and fatigue with the US engaged all around the world in ways that was highly expensive. He comes with a certain amount of leverage because of both COVID and Trump. On the one hand, everyone recognizes the consequences of the US not leading. And on the other hand, they realize to sustain an American position of leadership, they're going to have to play more of a role to deflect some of the costs of that, commit more to their own costs of security, but also share the burden. I think that Biden comes in very much with this mindset of this combination. We'll lead, we'll listen, but others also have to play a role. And what's more, they understand they will have to make it easier for us to play and sustain a leadership role. That's very much Biden. Now, Biden, in terms of Gates saying been wrong in every issue, you know, I testified before Biden's committees. I don't recall him being wrong on all the issues. On Iraq, early on, especially when the sectarian conflict became so profound, so brutal, so costly, He raised the idea of creating decentralization. He didn't say, let's suddenly create 3 separate states. He said, let's create a federal system. Well, in that context, that was not such an unreasonable position to adopt. He didn't say confederation, he said federal, which meant you still had a central government. On Afghanistan in 2009, when the administration was debating, should we increase our presence there? His position was we shouldn't be engaging in nation building in Afghanistan. It's a fool's errand. No one has ever succeeded in doing it. This was his argument. He said we have a counter-terror stake there, and we should be focused on a minimal presence related to counter-terror. I think he was more right than those who argued, including Bob Gates, for increasing our presence there. And just one other sideline, which is not so much about being right or wrong, but about who he is. Jason, this won't surprise you, but in the height of the second Intifada, I was over there and I was staying at the King David, and I went down for breakfast. And this is when the bombings were going off in Jerusalem and all around the country. And there were 3 people down for breakfast in the King David. The big room where they serve breakfast. 3 people, and who were they? It was me. And who did I see when I walked in there? Joe Biden and Tony Blinken. And why was he there? Because he wanted to get a sense of what was going on. He wanted to get a sense of, how Israel was coping with the terror. And he wanted to have discussions about what we could do to be helpful. Now, again, that doesn't strike me as someone who doesn't get issues the right way.
That's really important. Thank you very much for that, Dennis. So let's talk about some of this, kind of drill down on some of the specific challenges that we'll be facing President Biden. We were talking before about the Abraham Accords, so let's talk about that a little bit more. Do you see President Biden picking up the ball and running with it, widening this circle of Arab-Israeli peace that we have just now seen in the last 3 months suddenly include 3 more Arab countries? Will that be a priority for him? Will it happen on its own?
Well, I don't think the Middle East as a whole is going to be a priority. I think Israeli-Palestinian issues will not be a priority, though I think there'll be diplomacy associated with it, but I think it'll be very much related to the heart of your question. You're not going to see big new initiatives launched, but you're going to see, I think, diplomatic efforts to try to broker increasing understandings between Arab states and Israel. You asked about the paradigm. I think there's a recognition by Biden and at least people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. I think there's a recognition that there's something new here that's important to build on, and we can build on it. And maybe it's the way to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, bear in mind what the UAE did. The UAE came to the White House and said, we'll do normalization in return for no annexation and in return for access to weapons we've been denied because we're not at peace with Israel. The Emirates understood they could give the Trump administration a win in foreign policy, but the price was no annexation. So there was a kind of linkage here. They were saying, we will fully normalize with Israel. And to be fair, this has to be in a context. I said in February 2009, they were already working together. If I were to chart through from 2009 to 2020, starting from 2015 on, you began to see increasing, and you know it because of your own presence out there, increasingly visible Israeli presence in the UAE, from having a diplomatic office in the International Renewable Energy Agency, to having Israelis compete in judo tournaments there, to having the Minister of State and Culture go there in a quite visible way, to allowing, if there had been the Expo 2020, allowing Israel to have its own pavilion and Israelis to come on their own passports. This was before they had full normalization. So they crossed the threshold. And when they crossed that threshold, they created, in a sense, they broke a glass ceiling. They created a new kind of psychology and they sent a message. The message was, yes, we're not indifferent to the Palestinian cause. So we did create this kind of linkage, but we're going to pursue what's in our interests. Bandar bin Sultan, someone who was a very long-serving Saudi ambassador in the United States, gave a 3-part series to All Arabia, which was basically almost a documentary debunking the whole Palestinian narrative, talking about Palestinian mistakes historically, the Palestinian leaders' mistakes, missing opportunities, and getting cover from the Saudis and others, which only compounded their mistakes. And basically was saying, no more, we will now, and I'm quoting now, we have to pursue what's in our interest, not the Israeli challenges to the Palestinians. And he was saying this in public. Now, again, I want to tell you another anecdote. So I was the principal author of the Clinton Parameters in December of 2000. We were asked by the Israelis and the Palestinians to offer a bridging proposal. That's what the Clinton Parameters were. I decided to present it to Bandar privately before we presented it to the Israelis and Palestinians. Why? Because I knew that Yasser Arafat would misrepresent what we presented. So I wanted to insulate against that. And I wanted the Saudis to pressure him to accept it. When I presented it to him, his reaction was, if Arafat doesn't accept this, this won't be a mistake, it'll be a crime. But he said that in private. Now, other Arab leaders and officials would repeat their criticisms in private to me about the Palestinians, maybe not as dramatically as Bandar, but I would hear it all the time, but you never heard it in public. Now suddenly you see it in public. And what you're seeing is two dynamics at the same time that are connected. One is these Arab states are increasingly going to pursue what's in their own interest and not let the Palestinians determine whether they can do that or not. And two, they're no longer afraid of the Palestinian ability to arouse public sentiments against them. Now that's huge. Now it can still be something that's turned to the advantage of the Palestinians if they recognize it. And if they don't, they'll be left behind. And here, I think a new administration, a Biden administration, will understand, okay, the Arabs are giving us something to work with because they're reaching out to Israel. Now that can over time affect the Israeli psychology towards the Palestinians. It can provide cover for the Palestinians, but you can also do a step-by-step approach. Many of the Arab states are going to mirror what the Emirates did, meaning they didn't move all at once. The Emirates did it over a period really of 10 to 12 years. Now, it won't take to 10 to 12 years now, but the Saudis, if they're going to move, they'll move in steps. And we can talk about the meeting that took place the night before last in a minute. They'll move in steps. Now, every time they take a step towards the Israelis, you can broker something. Okay, we're going to take the step towards you. Let's talk about the steps you could take towards the Palestinians. And the Palestinians themselves will have to play. And it's in the Israeli interest to do this also, because many on the right in Israel may say, look, we don't have to change a thing. The Palestinians are losing, which is true, and we're winning. There's only one problem. One senior Arab official said to me recently, when I was discussing this, he said, look, the Palestinians aren't our problem, they're Israel's problem. And he was right, because they're not going anyplace. Israel will have to have a way to deal with them if it wants to ensure that it remains a Jewish democratic state. So here is, I think, something understood by the people coming in with Biden, that there is a new reality in the region and it creates a possibility that wasn't there, and it can be used to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. One last thought on this. The Palestinians resumed security coordination with the Israelis, resumed receiving their own money from the Israelis. There is a kind of functional cooperation for obvious reasons, but there have not been direct political talks between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, for 6 years. We've not had direct political discussions since the spring of 2014. So there's a stalemate, and trying to focus exclusively or alone on the Israeli-Palestinian issue will only deepen the stalemate because the gaps are so wide. But the Arabs create a new mechanism and a new potential, and a new administration, I believe, will recognize that. Just note, if you recall, Biden immediately, even when the announcement, before the, in July, when the announcement was made about the breakthrough, before the ceremony, the then Vice President Biden immediately came out and endorsed it. Didn't play politics with it, didn't somehow try to deny that this was a good thing because the Trump administration was presiding over it. He immediately came out and endorsed it. And that tells me there's an understanding that this is not only a positive, but you can build on this positive.
It's very exciting. What we've been saying across the Arab world for 25 years is you're not helping the Palestinians by pretending that Israel doesn't exist. You'll actually give yourselves and give the Palestinians leverage if you engage Israel, if you lower the concern that Israel has about the risks it'll have to take for peace, you'll be able to influence the Israeli bargaining position, and you'll be helping the Palestinians if you engage Israel. And obviously, over time, these messages filtered through your messages, the government's messages. It's wonderful that we've reached this point. It's just a terrible shame that it's taken so very long.
It's true. It's true.
Let me ask about. I'm sorry.
Jason, let me just add one thing on this. It's not only, look, it began, as I said, the relationships were covert, under the table, and they were driven by security considerations. But it's changing now. The UAE is enthusiastic about this peace. It's not only they don't share a border, it's not only they never fought a war, they never had a state of war. It's that they see themselves as the most advanced Arab economy marrying with the most advanced economy in the region. You know, one of the things that is telltale about how enthusiastic they are, when they wanted to do the civil aviation agreement and work out the number of flights. So Israel presented, proposal, 14 flights a week. And they said, are you kidding? They said, we want at least 4 times that. They ended up settling on around 36 to 40. The initiative, the enthusiasm was coming from their side. And it just tells you this is very different now. And there's something else that's going on. Sudan, there was all these predictions about how there'd be a backlash in Sudan, which hasn't happened. And what's the delegation the Sudanese requested from the Israelis? A delegation to come and talk about agriculture.
Yeah.
You are dealing now with countries that realize they have profound needs, food security needs, profound water problems because of drought conditions. They look at Israel and they see a country that can help them on water issues, on food security, on pharmaceuticals, on cyber. Across the board, they see that Israel can help. So what's driving this is not only the security concerns, which was the original impetus. You have something much more profound that's also driving this. And it doesn't mean it's all going to be instant. You know, as we said earlier, old habits die hard. There was a socialization process of making Israel the demon and the Palestinians the victim, and the cause of Palestine being a source of justice. So attitudes of the publics are changing, but they don't change overnight. It is interesting, if you look at the polling, they're very positive in the UAE. In other places, the numbers don't approach that, but they're still far different from what they would have been. Just to give you an example, in Saudi Arabia, 40% think that what the UAE did is a good thing, 40%. Now, if this had happened 2 years ago without the same kind of conditioning, or without, I'll put it this way, the same regional context, I think that number would have been less than half. So we take this poll in another year, I think the number will be different. So things are changing. The governments will measure the pace at which they make this change. But it's clear their interest in what Israel has to offer them is not just in the security area.
In fact, I think I remember talking to an Israeli diplomat about the efforts in Sudan, and I believe that Israeli agricultural technology is poised to, I think, double wheat production in Sudan and triple the production of sesame. I believe that sesame exports part of the Sudanese economy. But talking about enthusiasm in the UAE, I remember seeing at Rosh Hashanah a Rosh Hashanah insert in the Khalij Times of the UAE. And I remember years ago, being in the UAE and looking at newspapers where every day it had a story headline, datelined Al-Quds, and it was about the latest Israeli atrocity. How fundamentally that's changed. It's so dramatic, so exciting.
So look, it is a sea change, and it has to be understood. Something very dramatic is taking place, and again, for many, it's hard to give up what was the old paradigm, and to think that somehow, gee, but these are authoritarian states that are doing this, and somehow, by the way, the Palestinian Authority is not, or Hamas is not. I mean, it's the contradiction there is extraordinary, but it's also, there's a lack of recognition of what this means and how everyone can benefit from it. And I think, look, part of the challenge of all of us is to tell this story and to explain what can be done.
we're running close to the time that I really have to give up the microphone here to our audience, but I want to squeeze in one last question for you, Dennis.
Sure.
There are many who supported Joe Biden's candidacy in the hope that he would seek to return the United States to the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, from which President Trump withdrew in 2018, as we were discussing earlier. Is returning to the JCPOA even an option for President Biden? If so, how do you see the potential for a more comprehensive deal being realized? And if diplomacy were to move forward, what advocacy role would you see for Israel and its new peace partners in the Gulf? I think the chance of actually joint lobbying by Israeli and Arab Sunni Gulf diplomats is real. It wasn't real years ago.
Absolutely. So let me, again, there's a lot in this question. So let me try to parse it in a number of ways. The first part of the question was, will President-elect Biden really return to the JCPOA? His publicly stated position is that he is ready to return to it, but he's also conditioned it by saying compliance for compliance. That's a very important statement, because our compliance means we have to give sanctions relief. When he says compliance for compliance, he's saying implicitly we cannot give sanctions relief before Iran is back in compliance with the JCPOA and all the limits that it has now transgressed. Now that may seem simple to many people, but it's not simple. To give one example, the Iranians have accumulated 12 times the amount of low-enriched uranium that they had after they implemented the JCPOA. Now, for them to get back to the 200 kilograms as opposed to the 2,400 kilograms they now have, they either have to blend it, dilute it, or ship it out of the country. This is not something you do by flipping a switch. When I've seen estimates that are anywhere from 4 to 6 months for the Iranians to take the steps to get back into compliance. Now, if they're not in compliance and we can't give them sanctions relief because they're not in compliance over a 4 to 6 month period, that doesn't sound like it's so easy to move back into the JCPOA. So that's point one. Point two is the Biden administration, we'll see what it does, but it might want to make a virtue of necessity. And what I mean by that is, one of the lessons that the Iranians will have learned from the experience is, if you're going to do a deal with the United States, you want to be sure it's not reversible, which means it probably has to have congressional buy-in. You're not going to get Republican buy-in to the JCPOA. And what I mean by making a virtue of necessity, you may want to do an interim step so that the Iranians either freeze or roll back, at least in part, what they've done. And in return for that, they don't get full sanctions relief, but they get a kind of parallel set of reliefs. That, for example, there are countries that we allowed for 1 year under the Trump administration to continue to buy oil from the Iranians, and then we revoked the waivers. You could allow some of those waivers. You could restore some of those waivers. Or the Iranians are denied access to bank accounts they have that is actually their money that they got from selling oil earlier. You could allow some of those accounts, they could have access to some of those. This would be a limited step if the Congress were fully briefed in advance, and they'll accept the objective of wanting to prevent Iran from becoming a threshold nuclear weapon state. They'll accept the objective of wanting to contain their ballistic missile program. They'll accept the objective of wanting to contain and counter what they can do in the region. The issue isn't going to be over the objectives. The issue is going to be over what are the policies and tactics you pursue to achieve that. So taking this interim step on this, consulting with the Congress, and by the way, consulting with the Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis, and making clear how we're proceeding will reduce some of the angst that they have and reduce the impulse, at least I would say in the Israeli case, but maybe also, as you were pointing out, you could have a kind of joint lobbying, which you didn't have before. It will reduce that impulse, and it will bring them into the picture of what the administration is doing, making them more likely, first of all, to feel they have some input, so they're not being acted upon without any consideration of their interests or concerns. That, I think, gives you the promise of a more effective approach. Now, the question will be, what do you have to be able to offer the Iranians to be able not only to produce this, but then also to produce what is the equivalent of more for more? Meaning, we want the sunset provisions to be moved out another 15 to 20 years, meaning the limitations that would lapse on 2030, they don't lapse until 2045 or 2050. Okay, what are the Iranians going to ask in return? They didn't get the economic benefits they thought even when Obama was there because of non-nuclear sanctions. We have human rights sanctions legislatively mandated. We have terror-related sanctions legislatively mandated. So it's not so simple for them to get the economic benefits they expect, and that too is something that we'll have to work through. It's a complicated set of issues, but I think it can be more sustainable from the administration's standpoint if it consults with the Congress, brings them into the picture, if it consults with those in the region, if it creates a common front with the British, the French, and the Germans, which still which gives the administration an interest in saying, we're ready to return to the JCPOA because they favor that, but they also recognize it's not automatic. And what I'm suggesting is, why not make a virtue of necessity, which I think you can then reconcile all of these different kinds of potential sources of tension or conflict in your conflicting pressures that the administration is going to face.
Understood. Thank you for laying that all out, Dennis. Let's now turn it over to Nancy Lisker, the HAC Regional Director, for questions from our participants. Nancy?
Thank you, Jason. The first question is about the Netanyahu meeting in Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Ross, can you tell us about how that meeting came to fruition? Why did the Foreign Affairs Minister deny the meeting? And does the Crown Prince fear a conservative backlash?
So let me explain about this, because I think the reporting about this has also been wrong in one respect, but let me first explain or answer the question. Yossi Cohen, who is the head of Mossad, is the one who paved the way for this and worked out the agreement, but I think the agreement to meet, but I think you also have to understand why would MBS, why would the Crown Prince agree to the meeting now? And the answer is severalfold. First, he's very mindful that he has a problem with the Democrats. He has a real image problem with Democrats because of Khashoggi, because of the way the war in Yemen has been conducted. And he has an incoming administration. He knows how important the American relationship is to Saudi Arabia. And he wants to send a signal that will begin to improve his image. So it's not an accident this took place after the president-elect Biden was elected, and as it becomes clear that there's no question that he's going to be president. So that's his motivation for having the meeting. There's a motivation. Bibi has political motivations, shows he's indispensable, but the two of them have had a practical mission here. They want to basically coordinate their message. It gets to, Jason, the point you were raising about joint lobbying. It's not quite joint lobbying, but they want to coordinate their message to the Biden administration on how they see Iran, how their concerns and fears about how to approach the nuclear issue, their concerns about what Iran is doing in the region, and not somehow be pursuing the nuclear issue to the exclusion of what Iran is doing in the region, which was the perception of what was done that they shared about the Obama administration. So that helps to explain both the timing and the content. Now, there's misreporting. Everyone is saying that the foreign minister denied there was a meeting. You have to read his tweet carefully. What did he deny? He said that he was in the meeting with Pompeo and the Crown Prince, and there was no one else in that meeting. What he was denying was that there was a three-way meeting. Go back and read the tweet. He doesn't explicitly say there was no meeting between the Crown Prince and Netanyahu. He was explicitly saying there was no three-way meeting, which, by the way, happens to be true. So there's been misreporting on this because there was a very quick seizure of his statement, say, oh, they're denying it. Now, to be fair, they haven't acknowledged it publicly. Now, part of the reason for that is, again, they're going to move step by step. If you're going to give something that's more public, you're going to do it in all likelihood when Biden is the president, number one. And number two, he probably is testing what's the reaction. to this. And when I say reaction, I mean both domestically, but I also mean what's the reaction here of the incoming administration to this. So that would explain no rush to have public acknowledgement, but maybe I'm of the habit of having written too many diplomatic texts and having read too many, that I immediately sort of latched on the artful way that the foreign minister made his statement.
Also, of course, it was 2 years ago that Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Oman, and there still is not a political relationship at the formal level between Oman and Israel. We may find ourselves with a kind of a long, as you were saying before, kind of a long implementation of normalization by the Saudis, maybe even longer than 2 years.
Look, I think as long as the king is there, it's not so likely you'll see full normalization, but you'll see steps. And look, the idea that the crown prince sees Netanyahu, no way he does that unless, he's not going to let it come out and blindside the king. The king would have approved this. And I don't believe this was an unauthorized leak. It's very clear it was an authorized leak. Knowing Prime Minister Netanyahu the way I do, I am quite certain that he would have said, do you object to us letting this be known that it took place? If he had been told no, he would have respected that. So obviously he wasn't told no, and it was in the Crown Prince's interest to let it be known, even though that didn't require open acknowledgement of it. And as you noted correctly, there still is a wide gap here between even when you acknowledge, that's not the same thing as normalization. It's a process, and it will be a process.
Very interesting. Nancy?
Thank you. There are some follow-up questions about Iran and what Israel will do. Will it attack or not Iran during a Biden administration?
Look, I think, again, I can put this in some more historic perspective. I spent 3 years in the first 3 years in the Obama administration in the first term. During that first term, and I was intimately involved in this, the level of cooperation, consultation with Israel and Iran was unprecedented. We actually asked the Israelis in 2009 to constantly furnish us their views of how Iran was skirting sanctions and how we could plug the holes and which sanctions would have the greatest effect. We were constantly presenting to them what we were doing to create pressure on the Iranians, but also we let them know throughout this process that if diplomacy failed and it came to the use of force, they were brought into the picture of the kind of options we were developing, unprecedented, not shared with anyone else. So there was a very close collaboration with Israel during the first term. In the second term, a lot of the lineup was different, and the relationship with Israel was handled differently. Ultimately, I think in a Biden presidency, his instinct, this is a guy who is emotionally connected to Israel. He has a deep emotional attachment to Israel. I think that he will focus extremely heavily on the idea of deepening consultations again. Look, it is Tony Blinken in 2014 during the 52-day conflict between Gaza and Israel, when Israel was running out of Iron Dome missiles, needed to have a new production line, needed $250 million to be allocated so it could have that production line. It was Tony Blinken that I think Ron Dermer went to, the Israeli ambassador, explained the problem. He went to the president and got this approved immediately. So you have people in the key positions who view Israel through a certain lens and see cooperating with Israel, especially in security, as an imperative, as a requirement, as part of how we approach the relationship. Doesn't mean there won't be differences. Look, for sure, if there's a surge of settlement building, there's going to be differences, and it'll be public. My guess is it'll be clear. On the issues where we disagree, the administration will make clear what its views are. but it's not going to allow that to create a wedge between it and Israel. And you're not going to see, unless, I don't see the Prime Minister of Israel again adopting a position where he's going to go to the Congress and try to appeal over the head of the president. I would be surprised to see that. In part, I'd be surprised to see it because, again, this prime minister has a very long relationship, deep relationship with Biden. He said this when he acknowledged, when he was congratulating Biden. One of the things he drew attention to was a long personal relationship he had with Biden. And he knows they can have disagreements, but those disagreements can be managed. So when it comes to Iran, I expect that there will be a resumption of very close consultation. I expect that we will keep the Israelis in the picture, and I expect Israeli concerns will be taken seriously. Doesn't mean we'll always agree, but I do think you're going to see much more of an effort to keep the Israelis in the picture and not surprise them. They were surprised a couple of times in pretty profound ways during the Obama administration.
Thank you, Dennis. Nancy, is there time for one last quick question?
Yes, there's time for one last question, and this is on domestic issues. How likely do you think that it is that some or all of the appointments will be blocked by this, President Biden's appointments will be blocked by the Senate? And which of these appointments do you think are the most vulnerable?
Well, of the people who've been appointed so far, none of them will be blocked. There'll be, those Republicans who are looking towards 2024 may be the ones who will vote against them, but most of them will not. Most of them will vote for him. The message that was going to Biden from the Republicans was, if you pick mainstream people, we'll vote for them. And he has picked mainstream people in the national security area. So I don't believe I don't think none of these are controversial appointments. And I think that was done quite deliberately by the president-elect. We'll have to see who's appointed on the domestic side. But again, his appointment of Secretary of the Treasury, I think in a lot of ways is inspired. And I think that she is someone who is very much respected on both sides of the aisle. So that's the first appointment that has more of a domestic focus, although the Secretary of Treasury has an international focus as well. But you'll have to see for some of the other appointments whether or not that will produce a different reaction on the domestic side. But of these appointments that have been made, these are mainstream people who are basically centrist. They're a reflection of who Biden is. Biden is a centrist. And in the one debate where he responded to President Trump when President Trump kept focusing on Bernie Sanders, and he said, look, you're not running against Bernie Sanders, you're running against Joe Biden.
And Dennis, doesn't it say something about America that 3 of the 4 cabinet appointments announced yesterday are Jews? And it says something about America.
It says something pretty remarkable about America. Tony Blinken was quite, I think, eloquent and emotional in talking about his stepfather, Holocaust survivor. The Homeland Security Secretary has his own extraordinary story, also Jewish. It says something also about Biden and who Biden is. So, look, I feel we've come through what is an unbelievably difficult period of demonization and fundamental threat to our institutions, and even the underpinnings of how you conduct free and fair elections, which is the heartbeat, the soul of what is a democracy. And yet, basically, the system worked. And you have Republican secretaries of state who stood up and said they're going to protect the integrity of the process. Again, maybe we've been through a harrowing experience, but I think we can take pride in what is emerging. And the fact is, we have institutions that have withstood a certain challenge. I think we can all be proud of that.
Dennis, thank you for what has been a fascinating conversation. And I want to thank AJC Kansas City and AJC St. Louis and the St. Louis Jewish Federation for
We
making
can do Kansas City.
making this all possible. Yeah, we'll do it to Kansas City next week. So thank you, St. Louis. And now let's turn it over to our friend Karen Scher to close us out.
Jewish Federation of St. Louis. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Ambassador Ross, so much for being with us this evening and for such an insightful diplomatic analysis. We really appreciate you being with St. Louis tonight. And so on behalf of Jewish Federation and AJC, my colleague Nancy Lisker, and of course again to you, Jason, I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And we hope to see you at future events. I want to wish you all a very happy, healthy, and safe Thanksgiving and holiday season. May we all just go from now to strength and good health. So thank you all. Good night.